Yeah, well, this is really a sea change for our industry, and President Trump has really breathed life back into this industry.
Coinbase founder and CEO Brian Armstrong was part of today's summit, and he joins us now exclusively from the White House. Brian, it's great to have you back on.
Thank you for having me.
So you literally just got out of the room, and that's exactly where I want to start with you, because this is very much a 180-degree pivot from what we saw with the last administration. And in terms of the policy that's beginning to roll out, your analysis of this moment we're in and how the administration plans to move forward.
Yeah, well, this is really a sea change for our industry, and President Trump has really breathed life back into this industry, and it's already having a positive effect in America. For instance, Coinbase is planning to hire over 1,000 people right here in the United States due to the resurgence of this industry, and so it's already leading to American prosperity. Now, he announced last night that there's an executive order to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. This is incredibly exciting because the U.S. leading on this front, I think, is going to cause the rest of the G20 to take notice and think about Bitcoin as a successor to gold. It's a new gold standard. It's more efficient. Government should hold a strategic reserve of Bitcoin, in my opinion. And so the U.S. is now on offense. It's leading, and I think the rest of the world is going to follow.
And the details we're starting to get are that maybe it's $17 billion worth of Bitcoin that have been seized and are being held by the U.S. government currently. And yet Bitcoin is under pressure today. Why?
Yeah, well, it's true. In the past, the U.S. government has ended up holding Bitcoin and other crypto assets due to various agencies and law enforcements that have a reason for it. But in this new strategic Bitcoin reserve, they're actually planning to buy new Bitcoin in a tax-neutral way or a budget-neutral way so that it doesn't affect the taxpayer. That's a really big deal. Now, I was surprised, as you were, if the United States government came out and said it's going to be a holder of Bitcoin indefinitely and actually a buyer of Bitcoin in a budget-neutral way, I would have expected the price to rally even further. But whatever's happening in the short term, I'm confident that in the long term, this is going to be an upward trend for Bitcoin.
What are the details around how this reserve is stood up? For example, the custodian of choice. There had been some speculation going into this possible policy announcement that Coinbase could be in the running for that position.
Well, that wasn't discussed today, and I think that there should be a fair and transparent process for various companies to bid on that. But Coinbase has been a provider of crypto custody and trading services to the U.S. government proudly for many, many years, various agencies within the government. And so I hope that we get to throw our hat in the ring there as well.
Brian, what do you say to people who are disappointed that the government isn't committing to buying Bitcoin beyond a tax-neutral way?
Well, I wouldn't really agree with that as a criticism. I think that it's smart the way that they did it in a budget-neutral way. Otherwise, I think it would just raise questions about where that's coming from. But I thought they were very smart the way they landed it. And in addition to that, the crypto strategic stockpile, they said we're not going to be going out and buying these. But if the U.S. government comes into possession of those through some other mechanism, they're going to hold on to it. And so I think they're just reinforcing that this is a neutral process. It's Bitcoin focused, and it's going to be fair and orderly and not cost the U.S. taxpayer anything.
Remind the American public and investors why you need a Bitcoin reserve at all.
Well, good to be here. I mean, the reason why we need a Bitcoin reserve is that the federal government already owns some. In fact, it obtained around 400,000 Bitcoin over the past decade through criminal and civil forfeitures and seizures. And so the government has to have a strategy for how it deals with this. In the past, the strategy has been simply to sell it, in an ad hoc way, almost willy-nilly. And that cost American taxpayers something like $17 billion in lost value. So we want to have a long-term strategy to maximize the value of these holdings. And we've decided that Bitcoin is scarce, it's valuable, and that it's strategic for the United States to hold on to this as a long-term reserve asset. So that's the plan with the 200,000 Bitcoin that we believe are in the possession of the federal government. I say we believe because no one really knows for sure because we never had a proper audit. So that's one of the first things that this executive order provides, that we're going to do a full government-wide audit to find out what digital assets we actually have so they can be safeguarded and moved into a strategy that maximizes their long-term value.
Right. And then there's the stockpile. Talk to us about the nuance there and why you need a stockpile for altcoins and how you're treating them differently.
Right. Well, the idea there is, again, we're going to figure out what do we actually have on the federal balance sheet, and we're going to move those, like you said, altcoins or digital assets other than Bitcoin into a stockpile for safekeeping. The difference there is that the Secretary of the Treasury will exercise responsible stewardship over those assets, and he has the discretion to rebalance the portfolio or to sell items in that portfolio. But that's not true for Bitcoin. The Bitcoin we want to keep long-term. So there's a difference there in objective. With the reserve, the goal is long-term preservation. With the stockpile, the goal is responsible stewardship, portfolio management in essence.
David, the executive order also tasks Secretary Lutnick and Bessent with finding budget-neutral ways that won't cost the taxpayer to add to that reserve. What qualifies as budget-neutral? Can you give us some examples of how that would actually work?
Well, budget neutral just means it won't cost the taxpayer anything. It won't increase the deficit. It won't increase the debt. So that's basically the constraints on what they can do. If they can figure out creative ways to add to the stock to the reserve of Bitcoin, they're allowed to accumulate more Bitcoin. But again, it cannot impose any burden on the federal deficit, debt, or the taxpayer. So that's the rule. Now, you can ask the question, well, how are they going to do that? And I think that's sort of up to them. If they can figure out creative strategies that they believe are in the long-term interest of the country, they now have the authorization to develop those strategies.
Do you think using savings that come from Doge, for example, qualify as something that would be budget neutral?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that that's something that have to be assessed by probably the Office of Management and Budget. I think that since Doge is cutting the deficit, and we'd want to seek a way to rescind those appropriations. It probably would not count, but you probably have to ask the OMB that.
When you talk about the stewardship, particularly the stockpile, could you be seeing things like staking, lending? Is there going to be other ways to maximize the volume there?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the idea of this executive order is to create the mandate, right? So first of all, we're going to move these digital assets from wherever they are all over the government. We're going to find out what they are. First of all, we're going to do the accounting. We're going to do the audit. Then we're going to move them into a separate account for safekeeping. And then the Secretary of the Treasury and his team will be able to exercise portfolio management and long-term and responsible stewardship. And yes, that could include staking. It could include rebalancing. It could include sales. These are all options that they can pursue if the Secretary of the Treasury believes that these are in the long-term interests of the American people.
Just going into what's in the holding of the U.S. government, going back to what President Trump mentioned over the weekend, talking of Ripple, Solana, other alternative coins, that people are wondering whether they're going to be included in this stockpile. Will they? Does the U.S. own them? Why mention them by the president?
Well, the president just mentioned the top 5 cryptocurrencies by market cap. So I think people are just reading into this a little bit too much. He just mentioned the top 5. In terms of what we'll actually have, again, we have to do the accounting. We're not sure, sitting here today, whether the federal government owns any of these alternative cryptocurrencies. We know it owns Bitcoin. I believe it owns some Ethereum. I'm not sure about the other ones. This is why we have to do the accounting, is that, to be honest, no one's been able to give us a straight answer yet in terms of what the federal government owns. And this is part of the problem, is that we've never really had a digital asset strategy before. And this is why we've, missed out on accumulating a lot of value for the American people.
David, you mentioned earlier that you don't have any additional cryptocurrency assets anymore. You've divested from your interests there. However, Secretary Lutnick in July mentioned that he had, quote, a shed load of Bitcoin. Do you think it's important for these stewards of the reserve and the stockpile to divest from their cryptocurrency interests? Do you know if they've done so already?
I can't speak to his situation. Every member of the administration has to go through the same ethics process and the same conflict of interest process that I've gone through. So I'll let him speak to his own situation. I can just say that in my case, I divested or sold all the cryptocurrency that I owned prior to the start of the administration. So there's no conflict in my case. I just want to have the right innovation policies for the United States.
Do you think it's important, though, to just not have that appearance of a conflict of interest?
Sure. I mean, look, we're all subject to 18 USC 208. These are the conflict of interest provisions. Every member of the administration is subject to that. But I'm not going to speak to anyone's situation. So we all are governed by the same conflict of interest rules. In my case, I chose to just divest everything to make it really simple. You should ask every other member of the administration what their situation is.
How about the president? Because I think herein lies some of the issues for those who are on the outside of crypto looking in and suddenly feel that the US president has an exposure to meme coins or Solana. How do you give the confidence to the US investor base and indeed US population that this is totally legit?
Well, honestly, I think you're kind of making something up there. I mean, how do you know that he has exposure to Solana? Is that something you just came up with?
Well, ultimately, when we think about the meme coin exposure in particular, and people trying to understand for what reason we have a Trump coin or Melania coin, is there a clearer way that the US president can disassociate himself from any upside when it comes to cryptocurrencies?
Well, I think he's already spoke to the Trump coin, and I think that is a collectible. The SEC said it's a collectible. Collectibles have no intrinsic value. They're not securities. They're in a different category. And I think as long as you issue a meme coin and disclaim that there's no intrinsic value, it can just be a collectible. So that is a different category, I think, than what we're talking about here with cryptocurrencies.
What do you make of some of the market reaction? I mean, clearly Bitcoin down earlier today on the back of just not really getting what they were hoping for. You know, if the government is not going to buy additional crypto, then what's really the benefit? But can you say for sure that the administration is not open to using taxpayer dollars in the future? Is that completely off the table?
According to the CEO, it is. We've said that this will not cost taxpayers a dime. So we've been very clear in this executive order that we will not use taxpayer funds to basically accumulate more crypto unless it can be done in a completely budget neutral way. No increase in the deficit, no increase in the debt, no use of taxpayer funds, no burden on the taxpayer. We've been very clear in this executive order about that.
David, let's move on to artificial intelligence, where you're also weighing in on policy there. The Biden executive order was repealed in January. What is in the works currently that you can share about how that's looking and who's involved?
So the president in his week one executive order on AI that rescinded the Biden EO, by the way, that was a very burdensome executive order that Biden had passed. It was over 100 pages of burdensome regulations on AI companies. The whole industry hated it. He rescinded that, and he tasked 3 people to basically evaluate and create a new AI action plan. And those people are the head of the Office of Science Technology Policy, the National Security Advisor, and myself. And so we're currently working on that plan. And we'll have more information for you about that once we're ready to present.
David, how confident are you at this moment around AI leadership here in the United States? That thick and fast, the news coming out of China, for example, of the latest models that are incredibly powerful with less data and ultimately more efficient. How are you exercising the view that AI can be still a leader for the United States and not losing its leadership versus China?
Well, I'm confident in American leadership, but we can't be complacent about it. I mean, it's very clear that China is going to be very, very competitive. Something like roughly half of the AI researchers in the world are from China. They are very good at math and science. And you've seen with the launch of DeepSeek that they're very good. They have very good AI software companies. So this is going to be a very competitive race, and we have to win that race, but we can't be complacent about that in any way. It's going to be a very tough competition here.
There's actually reporting from other news sources that maybe DeepSeek would be banned from apps here in the United States. Do you think that's appropriate?
It's premature for me to comment on something like that. If the administration announces a policy on that, then I'll comment on it then.
Let's talk about some of the other voices inside the White House as of late that could potentially chime in on AI policy. Elon Musk, is he involved in any capacity?
Not in what we're doing. So, again, we have an office within the White House, and we deal with crypto and AI policy. Elon's doing Doge, and these are 2 totally separate initiatives.
But let's talk a little bit more about what the contours of the AI policy could look like. I realize you can't share too much at the moment, but what will be your priority areas? A lot of the talk has been around AI competitiveness, and what we've seen coming out of President Trump's comments around the CHIPS Act and then National Science Foundation layoffs. There is some concern that this could undermine competitiveness if there's not enough federal funding going to research. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are some items that are policy items that are coming up very quickly. So, for example, there was this 11th hour policy that was announced by, or rule, that was announced called the diffusion rule that was announced by the Biden administration. And that governs the sale of advanced AI chips or GPUs to countries all across the world. They're basically an international version of the export controls. There's a 120-day clock on that in order for the Trump administration to weigh in and make whatever modifications we want to make. So, for example, I think that's probably going to be one of the first policy items on our plate that we have to address because there's a clock on it. So I think that, export controls are a big area, diffusion's a big area, just the, how we govern the licensing of the most sophisticated chips and semiconductor manufacturing equipment is sort of at the heart of the policy discussion right now.
Would you ultimately be supporting an end to the CHIPS Act?
I don't think that anyone in the administration has said we want to end it, but the president has been very critical of it, and I think with good reason. I mean, I think the intent of the CHIPS Act was good. We were trying to get semiconductor manufacturing to occur in the United States because it's so strategic. The problem is that the money went to, frankly, a lot of companies who are losing in that very competitive market, and some of those companies haven't even used the money that they were granted because they're not doing very well. So the CHIPS Act has had, I think, mixed results at a high cost. And the question is just whether we can do something much better. And I think what the president has said is that he would like to use tariffs as an incentive to get companies to onshore their semiconductor manufacturing here. And the advantage of that approach is that the best companies have to do it too. They can't kind of drag their feet or they're going to be hit with tariffs. So I think the president has figured out a very powerful weapon, a very powerful incentive to get the best companies to want to onshore their manufacturing, including for semiconductors, and that is very strategic for the United States.
TSMC putting money where its mouth is and potentially in response to tariff concerns. But are you
right.
saying
Well, you saw
that.
Yeah. Sorry, you mentioned TSMC. I think it's a very good point. We did a press conference with them just earlier in the week, and they announced over $100 billion investment in the U.S.
Right.
And a big part of the reason why is because of the president's tariffs policies, give them a strong incentive to want to move some manufacturing here, because they know that if they don't do that, they're going to be hit with a tariff.
With 45 seconds, David, I've got to ask you, therefore, should Intel not be getting the money? Is that the company you're hinting at?
I'm not saying they shouldn't get it, but I think that everyone knows that Intel is a very challenged company right now. And I think that it's unfortunate. We want Intel to do well. We want domestic chip manufacturing, and Intel is a legendary company. And it is one of the few companies in the United States that's capable of doing advanced chip manufacturing. So we want them to do well, and I think we will try to do whatever we can to help them do well.